When are you going to see a doctor? Niki grimaced as she glanced at Edna from the sink where she was washing her face after being deathly ill again first thing in the morning. I've just got that virus, she prevaricated. Edna walked into the room and closed the door. You're pregnant, and you know it, she said gently. Niki's face contorted. Tears rolled down her pale cheeks. He's gone back to Elise. What am I going to do, walk into his house and tell him he's going to be a father, when he's discussing remarriage with his ex-wife? Wouldn't that be a fine wedding present? Niki, he cares about you, she insisted. I pushed him over the edge, because he felt sorry for me. She lowered her eyes to the wet washcloth that she'd bathed her face with. It's not his fault. I was scared and desperate. I had some crazy idea that I could have a child before they did surgery and started treating me for cancer. But there isn't any cancer, and I don't know what to do now. I thought it might be something like that. He's a man who loves children, you know, she added. Niki drew in a long breath. He doesn't think he can father a child, Edna, she said quietly, staring at the sink. After all, Elise never got pregnant. He might not believe it was his, even if I told him. He told you that? She exclaimed. Well, no. He told Dad he thought he was sterile, and Dad told me. There's another problem. She glanced at the housekeeper while she bathed her wet eyes. Blair told Dad that Elise had been on drugs and that was why she acted the way she did. She's back to normal and going to be an actress. You know that Blair was crazy about her. I do, the older woman said gently. But honey, it's his baby. He has the right to know about it. Well, he's not going to. Not from me. Child, you can't hide it forever, Edna said. I know that. I've thought that I might move down to Colorado or Arizona and get a job with another mining company. You don't think your father would find out? Or that he wouldn't tell Mr. Coleman if he did? Edna exclaimed. Niki grimaced. I guess it does sound a little far-fetched. She pursed her lips. Your emotions are all over the place. You aren't thinking clearly. I'm not really sure that I am pregnant, Niki said stubbornly. It takes weeks to tell, doesn't it? It takes one day, with a blood test. You should see a doctor and make sure. Dr. Fred would call Dad. Then he'd call Blair. You could go to a doctor in another city, Edna persisted. Babies need a lot of prenatal care, she added worriedly. You need tests and vitamins and regular checkups. Niki knew that. She was almost certainly pregnant, but she wasn't brave enough to tell anyone. Especially Blair, who would hate her if she caused him to lose Elise. She was going to swear Edna to secrecy when the nausea came back. She assumed the position in front of the toilet and tried not to think of the smell of eggs. While Niki was throwing up, Edna went back to the kitchen to make chamomile tea to ease her stomach. Just as she reached the dining room, Blair walked in the door. He was somber and quiet, and he looked as if his world had ended. How is she? He asked Edna worriedly. She's all right now, isn't she? Edna had a thought. Her eyes twinkled. Let me show you how she is, Mr. Coleman. Follow me. She led him to the bathroom and cracked the door. Blair's expression underwent a remarkable transformation. His sad, hopeless face disappeared and changed into one of absolute exultation. He put a finger to his lips, went into the bathroom and closed the door. Niki was too sick to be aware of anything. She heard footsteps. Edna, can you wet me another cloth, please? She asked wearily, leaning her head on her arm over the toilet seat. Water was running. Then a wet, cool cloth was pressed into her hand. A big, husky man knelt beside her and turned her pale face to his. Niki, he whispered huskily. Niki. She couldn't even protest. Tears ran down her cheeks. He didn't look worried or sad. She'd never seen such an expression on his broad, leonine features. Blair, oh, God. the nausea came back. He didn't leave her until she was finally able to get up from the toilet. He helped her to the sink, helped her wash her face and use mouthwash. Then he picked her up like the treasure she was and carried her into the bedroom. He dropped into the big armchair by the fireplace and cuddled her close, holding the cloth to her forehead. "Didn't know how to tell you," she began unsteadily. "Dad said Elise never got pregnant, and you thought you might be sterile. I was afraid you might not even believe it was yours." "Of course I know it's mine, honey," he said softly. "Elise finally confessed to me that she was taking the pill the whole time we were married." She caught her breath. "And she didn't tell you?" He shook his head sadly. "We're going to have a baby." He drew in a long breath, and his face radiated joy. "I can't believe it," he chuckled. "I just can't believe it. What a delicious surprise." She flushed with pleasure. He brushed back her disheveled hair. He smiled tenderly, his black eyes fascinated with her. He smoothed down her blouse and over her still flat stomach. His big hand rested there with joyous possession. "You aren't mad about it?" she asked worriedly. He bent and kissed her eyelids, closing them. "Oh, no, I'm not mad, baby." She relaxed and let him take her weight. "I'm so sick," she moaned. "Have you been to Dr. Fred?" "I was putting it off," she said on a weary sigh. "He can give you something for the nausea. You'll need vitamins, as well, and tests." "A baby," he whispered huskily, and his whole face contracted. "God, it's Christmas." She searched his face with wide, fascinated eyes. "You really don't mind?" He laughed softly. "Do I look as if I mind?" He didn't. He looked years younger, full of life and hope. "Not really," she said finally. He curled her close and laid his cheek on her soft hair. "It will have to be a rushed wedding," he said, thinking out loud. "And nothing public, or we'll be swamped by the press. I have enough trouble with reporters when they're not prying into my private life. You'll need a gown, and I have to get rings." Her head fell back on his shoulder. "You want to marry me?" she asked, disbelief on her face. He traced her soft mouth. "I've always wanted to marry you, honey," he said huskily. "But there was the pesky age thing. Then, when you started talking about children, I remembered that Elise had never gotten pregnant, and I was afraid that I was sterile. I was afraid to take the test." "That sounds familiar," she sighed. He kissed her tenderly. "We're both cowards," he teased. She laughed softly. Her small hand went up to stroke his hard cheek. "Yes, we are." He caught the hand in his and kissed the palm. "We could have the service here, if we can find a minister who'll marry us. Otherwise, it might have to be a justice of the peace." "Why?" she asked, puzzled. "Some ministers still won't marry a divorced man to another woman," he said simply. "I would really like to be married by a minister," she said. "But I don't mind if we have to do it the other way." He kissed her palm again. "I'll ask around. Your father might have some ideas." As if on cue, her father suddenly opened the door. "Edna said you were sick." He stopped dead at the sight of Niki lying in Blair's arms in the big chair. He stared at them both, and wheels were turning in his head. All of a sudden, he grinned. "Morning sickness?" he asked, and beamed at them. Blair laughed. Niki flushed. "Well," Todd exclaimed. "And here I thought I'd never get grandkids." "Listen, you two have to get married." "That's just what we were discussing," Blair said. "We'd like to be married here, by a minister." "I have a friend who's an ordained minister," Todd said. "He's not overly conventional. Suppose I ask him for you?" "The sooner, the better," Blair added when Niki suddenly scrambled off his lap and went running back to the bathroom. "Sorry," Blair told Todd before he followed her. "I'm getting into the daddy role as quickly as I can." Todd just laughed. Blair drove Niki to the doctor's office in his luxury rental car and sat holding her hand in the waiting room until she was called back. Even then, he wouldn't let go. Dr. Fred pursed his lips at the sight of Blair holding Niki's hand. He put two and two together with amazing perception. "Morning sickness?" he asked. Niki burst out laughing. "How did you know?" "He's a dead giveaway." He pointed at Blair. "He's got baby fever. There's no cure, I'm afraid." Niki was beaming. "I'm so happy." "I noticed." "Okay, let's get this show on the road," Morris said. "Blood test first, then the exam, and then we'll talk." "You staying?" he asked Blair. He hesitated when Niki blushed. "Maybe I'll sit in the waiting room and daydream while you examine her," he said. He kissed her forehead with a chuckle. "If you tell us she's not pregnant, I'm jumping off the roof," he told the doctor. "I swear." "I'll keep that in mind." "I promise," Dr. Fred chuckled. Blair left, winking at Niki before he left the room and closed the door behind him. "Well," Dr. Fred exclaimed. "If anybody had told me that Blair Coleman would be that excited about impending fatherhood, I think I might have fainted." "Me too," Niki said, shaking her head. "I didn't know how to tell him. You see, his first wife never got pregnant, so he thought he was sterile." "I think we can probably discount the sterility theory, if the tests substantiate the morning sickness," the doctor said. "Now, let me get the nurse in here, and we'll do a quick exam." Niki was floating on air when they left the building. "I can't believe it," she said excitedly. "I suspected, but it could have been so many other things." He tightened his grip on her fingers. He looked very smug. "Yes, it could have. But you said on the way over here that the eggs started off the nausea." "I hate eggs." He looked at her stomach. He chuckled. "He hates eggs too." She teased. He slid an arm around her shoulders as they walked toward the car. "Honey, there hasn't been a girl in my lineage in 5 generations, he said softly. "I would love a little girl. But a boy is much more likely." She looked up at him as they reached the car, with her heart in her eyes. "Please tell me you're not just pretending to be pleased, making the best of a bad situation. Even if you have to lie." He traced her soft mouth with his fingers. "I don't lie that well," he reminded her. He searched her soft gray eyes, loving the flush in her cheeks, the radiance of her face, the subdued beauty of her in the afternoon light. "I'm overwhelmed," he said finally. "Of all the things I've experienced in my life, this is easily the most profound. We made a baby, the first time." He smiled tenderly at her blush. He bent his head and touched his lips to hers. "It was a hell of a first time too." "Oh, yes," she agreed, sliding her arms around him. He drew in an unsteady breath. "We have to go shopping. I want a couture wedding gown for you. Something we can hand down to our children and their children." Her eyes searched his, hungrily. "I was so afraid to tell you." "I know." He hugged her close and rocked her. "I thought I might be sterile. I know how much you want children. When I thought I couldn't give you any." She pulled back and looked up at him with shock in her whole expression. "You thought it would matter?" she asked. He scowled. "Of course." She reached up and touched his broad, sexy mouth, his square jaw, his lean, hard cheek. "I want the baby because it's yours," she said hesitantly. "That's really the only reason I want it so much." His heart skipped a beat. He just stared at her. "You must know that I love you," she stammered. "I mean, I've done everything except wear a sign for years." She had to stop, because he was kissing her. His hunger was immediate, devouring, out of control. He didn't even notice amused eyes turning toward them in the parking lot as he lifted her in his arms, and groaned as he ground his mouth into hers. "I'm sorry, but it hurts," she moaned into his mouth, protesting the crush of his chest. "It hurts?" My breasts are very sore, she whispered, flushing again. It's part of the symptoms. I'm sorry, honey. So sorry. He eased his hold and kissed her mouth, her nose, her closed eyelids. I wouldn't hurt you for the whole world. I know that. I wasn't complaining, exactly. Well, not about being kissed, she laughed softly. He swung her around with a slow, warm smile and kissed her tenderly before he put her down. There was a fine tremor in his big arms. He stared at her with an expression she didn't understand. We have to go shopping, he said, repeating what he'd told her earlier. Suppose we fly down to Dallas? Okay, she agreed, stars in her eyes. She frowned. Why Dallas? He grinned. Neiman Marcus, he said with twinkling black eyes. A gown, and wedding bands for both of us, he added. You're going to wear one too, she asked, surprised. I belong to you, don't I? He teased. Her face radiated the joy she felt inside her. Yes, you do, she said, and she smiled up at him with her heart in her eyes. He might not love her, but he was fond of her, and he wanted her and the baby. It was more than enough to start with. Love, she reminded herself, could grow if it was properly fed. The department store was enormous, Niki thought, as she and Blair headed toward the couture section. She still felt a little nauseated, but it was fading. She was fascinated by all the gorgeous dresses. None of them seemed to have price tags, and she remarked on it to Blair. I own an oil corporation, he whispered back, amused. You can have anything in the store. And I mean anything. She searched his black eyes. I wonder if they have rawhide necklaces, she teased. He chuckled. We could ask. I'll worry about getting a wedding dress first. Be sure to get a veil to go with it, he said, and his face was somber and tender. A veil? He nodded. He moved closer, touching her cheek with the tips of his fingers. It's an old tradition. One that I love. Elise wore just a short purple dress, he added curtly. With you, I want the works. Especially a veil that I can lift when the minister marries us, he added in a husky, deep tone, so that I look upon your face for the first time as a bride, before anyone else in the world sees you that way. Tears ran down her cheeks. It was the most romantic thing he'd ever said to her. Oh, Blair, she whispered, overcome with emotion. His own eyes were misty. He averted them quickly. Get something beautiful. I will. He glanced down at her hungrily. You glow, he said softly. Mast, he added in Lakota. Sunshine. She smiled, her insides as radiant as her face. May I help you? A saleswoman asked gently, smiling as she approached. Yes, please, Niki said. I want a wedding gown. Something unique. And a veil too, she added, with a glance at Blair. I think we have just the thing, the woman said, not missing the interaction between the two of them. Come with me. Well, what did you get? Blair asked when the dress was bagged and concealed from his eyes, while he paid for it. Something beautiful, she replied. And it was. White with oceans of lace, a keyhole neckline, with tiny puff sleeves, imported lace, a fitted waist, flowing A-lined skirt and a long lace train behind. In addition, there was a veil that reached to her waist in front, secured by a tiara. It was the most beautiful thing Niki had ever dreamed of. And now it was hers. To marry the man of her dreams. Thank you, she added softly. He chuckled. I can't see it yet, I guess? She shook her head and smiled. Tradition. Ah, well. Come on, he said when he'd thanked the saleswoman and pocketed his credit card. Where to next? She asked excitedly, holding his big hand. The jewelry department. But first. He led her to the lingerie department, not the least embarrassed as he pointed her toward the most expensive peignoir sets. He paused at an off-white set with a low, lacy bodice. "What do you think?" he asked huskily. "It's beautiful." She bit her lip and looked up at him. "Blair, the wedding gown is white." He put a finger over her mouth. "You've been mine for 2 years. I've been yours for 2 years. A piece of paper and an official pronouncement are nice, but I haven't had a woman since the divorce." She was shocked, and looked it. "But, you went to Europe." Janet was there, and later, Elise. "I only want you," he said simply. His black eyes flashed as he looked at her. "White." She sighed and the light came back into her face. She nodded and smiled. "White." Later, they went to the jewelry department. The rings were horribly expensive. She saw the price tags and hesitated. "Money is no object, honey," he whispered in her ear. "Besides, these are a lifetime deal. No returns. Which means you can't ever leave me." "As if I could ever leave you," she said involuntarily, looking up at him with tenderness. A faint flush colored his high cheekbones, before he averted his face and pointed at a set of rings. "Could we look at those?" he asked the salesman. "Of course, Mr. Coleman," the man agreed with a grin. Blair was a rare customer, who always knew exactly what he wanted and could afford anything in the case. "He knows you?" Niki asked while the salesman went to get a measuring stick. He chuckled. "This is where I commissioned that orchid brooch I got you for Christmas the year I spent it with you and your father." "I see." He pushed the wedding ring set toward her. "What do you think?" The diamond was a canary yellow diamond. Blair wanted to buy her a 3-carat one, but Niki wanted something a little more subtle, so they settled on a 2-carat stone. It was set in an 18-carat gold band. The wedding band itself was studded with canary diamonds. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They remind me of you," he said. "They look like the sun captured in gold. Sunshine." She leaned against him. "I like them very much." "So do I." There was a man's wedding band with 3 large canary diamonds in a wide gold setting. He tried it on. It fit. So did both of Niki's. "Amazing," the salesman said. "I think that's a first." Blair looked down at Niki. "A good omen, I'd say." "So would I," she agreed. The salesman boxed them up, accepted Blair's credit card and completed the purchase. As they were walking away, Blair's phone rang. He answered it, chuckled and informed the person on the other end that he was shopping for his forthcoming wedding. There was a pause. He grinned again and thanked the caller. "The credit card company, just making sure it was me," he said with a grin. "You spent a fortune in there," she said, faintly worried. "Outfitting my beautiful, pregnant bride," he whispered, and bent to kiss her. "I'm the happiest man on earth right now." "Am definitely the happiest woman," she whispered back. Niki showed her wedding gown to Edna, who was almost overcome with its beauty. "My goodness, it must have cost a fortune," she exclaimed. "It did." He insisted. "It's going to be an heirloom," she said with a rapt smile. "He'll take care of you," Edna said suddenly. "And you'll never want for a thing, as long as you live." Except for love, Niki thought privately. Blair did want her, and the child, but he'd never once said that he loved her. She didn't expect it. One day he might grow to love her. It gave her something to hope for. Meanwhile, she'd make him happy, no matter what it took. Weeks later, the minister married them in the living room at her father's house, under an artificial arbor thick with white silk roses and ivy. When Blair slid the wedding ring onto her finger beside the engagement ring, tears threatened. When he pronounced them man and wife, they raced down her cheeks, hot and wet. Blair lifted the veil very slowly and pushed it back over her long, pale hair. He studied her with an intensity that made her heart race. He kissed the tears away before he touched his hard mouth hungrily to hers for one long minute. And they were married. The house was full of people, along with a photographer, one reporter who had an exclusive story, and Mr. Jacobs and his wife and little girl. Dr. Fred was there just long enough to see Niki married before he was called away. Tex grinned and kissed her cheek. The ranch's cowboys filed through to offer congratulations. "It was the nicest wedding I've been to in a very long time," her father sighed as he kissed his daughter's forehead. "And I must say, it's about time you two got your act together," he added sternly, with a quick glance at Blair. Blair sighed. He smiled at Niki. "I just had to get my priorities in order," he remarked, filling his eyes with his lovely new bride. "I suppose age isn't as important as other things," he added quietly. His eyes dropped to Niki's flat stomach, and his high cheekbones flushed with feeling. "I'd given up hope of ever having a child of my own." "My God, what a beautiful surprise." Niki beamed. She still worried that he might feel trapped, despite the fact that he denied it. But the look in his eyes couldn't be faked. She felt absolutely cherished. "I guess a granddaughter is out of the question," her father said, smiling at them. "It would be a very long shot," Blair had to admit. He grinned. "Boys are nice. One of my vice presidents has 3. He plays soccer with them." He drew in a breath. "I guess I'll need to work out in the gym more so that I can get in shape." "For 3 boys," her father teased. Niki laughed. "Or 4, she mused, with a wicked smile at Blair. "We can get the cowboys to learn soccer so they can help you out," Todd said. He grimaced. "I guess you'll both be living in Billings," he added with a touch of sadness he couldn't help. Blair looked smug. "Not really. I bought the old Vinings ranch down the road a couple of weeks ago," he added, surprising his best friend and his wife. "It needs some work, though, but it's going to be a showplace. I like horses. I thought we might raise purebred quarter horses. I have a livestock manager hired, and a ranch manager ready to interview." He glanced at Niki, who positively glowed. "We can move in next week, if things go according to plan. Meanwhile," he said with a tender smile, "we're going to be lying on a nice beach in Jamaica on our honeymoon." "I'll love that, living close to Dad and Edna," Niki said warmly. She ground her teeth. "Oh, gosh, my job." Just then, Mr. Jacobs joined them. "Nice wedding," he said, shaking hands with Blair and pausing to kiss Niki on the cheek. "Congratulations. I guess I'll be losing my best assistant ever here," he added with a sigh, glancing at Niki. "Afraid so," Blair chuckled. "I'll want her with me most of the time. Especially now." "Especially now?" Jacobs asked. Blair was beaming. "We're pregnant," he said, clasping Niki's hand closely in his. "Congratulations again." Jacobs chuckled. "You lucky devil. Kids are wonderful. God knows, I love mine." He glanced toward his daughter. She was leaning on a cane beside a nice-looking brunette, who was Jacobs's wife. "I hope they find something that can help your daughter someday," Niki said softly. Jacobs nodded. "They're coming up with new treatments all the time. But she has a wonderful attitude. She's always smiling, despite the pain and disability." "You're a sweet man, Mr. Jacobs," Niki said. "I'll miss working for you." He grinned. "Thanks. I hate to lose you. But I don't hate losing the health nut," he added with a sly glance at Blair. "I forgot to tell you about him," he added quickly, when Blair glowered at just the mention of the man. "Dan quit his job and went to work as manager of a health food store out in California." Niki and Blair burst out laughing. "At least now he has an excuse for handing out helpful advice," Niki agreed. "May he hand it out anywhere but Wyoming," Jacobs replied. "Amen," Blair seconded. The plane trip to Jamaica was a long one. Niki was asleep when their flight touched down in Montego Bay. "Time to wake up, sleepyhead," he teased softly. "We're here." "Gosh, already?" She yawned behind a small hand and stretched. I slept all the way, I guess. Sorry. I didn't mind. Gave me a chance to catch up on some work. He indicated the laptop he'd just put away in his briefcase. When they finally got through customs, Niki was wilting, and Blair quickly got them a cab to the hotel, which was right on the beach. It's lovely, Niki exclaimed when they checked in and were escorted to their room. The glass patio door opened onto the beach beyond. The room itself was huge and luxurious, with paintings on the wall and modern furniture and a jacuzzi in the huge bathroom. All the comforts of home, Blair agreed. He came up behind her and pulled her into his arms, nuzzling her neck with his lips. Tired? Terribly, she moaned. She turned to him. I'm so sorry. She looked as if she could barely keep her eyes open. He smiled complacently. It's the baby, honey, he said softly, and bent to kiss her. He's growing. The nausea is better, though, isn't it, with the pills? She nodded. Much better. I think the prenatal vitamins will help with the fatigue, too, but it's early days yet. Don't rush it. I want to enjoy every single minute of this, he said, his voice deep and husky with feeling. I never dreamed I could make you pregnant, he whispered at her mouth. I wanted to, so badly. You thought you were sterile. He lifted his head and nodded. His expression was solemn. Elise apologized for that. She was on the pill and never told me. He rocked her gently in his arms. She apologized for marrying me too. She was trying to get over the death of her significant other. Drugs, pills, booze, you name it, she did it. I didn't realize that either. It was why she was so cold to me when I got sick and ended up at your house, with you nursing me. She hated the mention of the other woman's name. Her face closed up. You loved her once, she said. She looked up at him worriedly. If you hadn't known I was pregnant, you might have gone back to her. Why are you laughing? He kissed her hungrily. Because going back to Elise was never an option. It wasn't? He lifted his head, and his eyes were soft and quiet. Honey, there's something you don't know about Elise. What don't I know? He brushed back her long, pale blonde hair. She's a lesbian,